My name is Lily Odarno. I'm the director of the Energy and Climate Innovation Program for Clean Air Task Force. And it's my pleasure to welcome you here today. At CATF, we aspire to catalyze a vision for Africa's energy and climate future where access to affordable, reliable, and clean energy supports prosperous economies. And it's my pleasure today to welcome you to the event, Modeling Africa's Energy Transition, which is a key product, is going to feature a key research product of the work that we've been doing in our Energy and Climate Innovation Program. To lead us through today's event is going to be a wonderful moderator, Dr. Zainab Usman. She is the director of the Africa program at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, and she will be your moderator today. It's my pleasure to welcome Zainab to take us through today's event. Thank you.
Oops. Sorry, it's not our fault. We're jet lagged and dehydrated, but we'll be fine. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Zainab Usman. I'm the director of the Africa. Great. I'm the director of the Africa program at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. This is a think tank in Washington, D.C. I'm really honored to welcome you here today for this very, very important discussion at this pavilion. As you know, for a lot of African countries, they are really between a rock and a hard place. And I'm hoping that the discussion we have today, based on the paper that is going to be presented, but also with the distinguished colleagues who are here today, will help us really unravel some of these trade-offs and complexities that African countries face. So what are these trade-offs? That on one hand, African countries face the urgency of climate adaptation and mitigation because of the disproportionate impacts of the climate challenge, the importance of honoring commitments made at various summits, including the one we're at, to achieve net zero, and very, very importantly, the need to prioritize socio-economic development and prosperity for all Africans who will, by 2050, will make up 1/4 of the world's population. It is critical then that global decisions on African countries' energy transitions and climate transitions more broadly are informed both by these development imperatives that we're very aware of, but also the exigencies of climate action. Homegrown knowledge generation on this front is very, very important. The climate research, the energy transition modeling, and projections that shape policy on Africa are most useful when they are grounded in African realities, with buy-in from African institutions, and when they reflect assumptions which are accurate about the continent's future energy needs and economic growth. Yet, one sobering finding that we're going to hear about from the presentation today by Dr. Moussa Blimpo and co-authors is that nearly 2/3 of research on the energy transition in Africa is actually produced without an author based on the African continent. Given this underrepresentation of African voices in climate policy, how should we think of the interplay between development priorities and the climate challenge in Africa? What can we do now to foster North-South collaborations, but also South-South collaborations in terms of knowledge production? So I'm very happy that we have Dr. Moussa Blimpo here and his co-authors to present the Climate Change and Economic Development in Africa paper, which is a systematic review of energy transition research. We will then hear from the World Bank's Chief Economist for Africa, who is joining us virtually. And then we'll have maybe about a 30-minute or so panel discussion with other distinguished colleagues. I would now like to invite Moussa Blimpo to come and do the presentation.
Thank you, Zainab. Let me join Lily and Zainab to welcome you again to this session. My name is Moussa Blimpo. I'm an assistant professor at the University of Toronto's Monk School for Global Affairs and Public Policy. And I'm also a senior fellow at the CATF, where we produce this work that I'm about to share with you. Of course, this is a co-authored work. I am barely a flag bearer today, and I would like to acknowledge all my co-author, but also the broader team that have provided us support within the CATF throughout this project. So let me get straight at it. I think Zainab gave a great overview of what we really did in this piece of work. What is the issue? The issue is one where we have two set of literatures that are sort of going in parallel, that are highly relevant for policy and for the future of the African continent, right? On one hand, you have the development discussion that is all about job creation, the large youthful population and large unemployment, underdevelopment. And in that circle, you will hear a lot about issues around industrialization. You look at national development policies of countries all around the continent, you will see that there. In the African Union's Agenda 2063, industrialization is featured there, but that has implication on the climate. Then you have a separate literature about the climate change action, where everything is about climate mitigation, and everything is about reducing emissions starting yesterday. So in that discussion, unless you bring these two issues together under the same roof, there may be, in many instances, apparent contradiction that may not fit together. On the climate side, for example, when you look at this graph that we are showing here, a lot of time when people talk about Africa having contributed less to the global emission in a cumulative sense, people think about historical cumulative emission, people think about the industrial revolution, but if you plot the same graph just the last 10 years or the last 20 years, which is what we are showing to you here, Africa is still emitting quite low, and that has an implication on the future development of the continent if the projections are going to keep these emissions at a very low level. So what we are doing in this systematic review is to start a conversation that will potentially lead to bringing these two literatures together and have this discussion. So what we are, the object in the paper, our main objective first is just to document the state of knowledge when it comes to the issue of energy transition modeling in Africa. We want to pay special attention to that development imperative that is very important for the continent. And what we did is a classic systematic review. We are not going to go into the nitty-gritty of the methodology for this audience and session here, but the paper is available for those who are interested in looking at the details. But we focus on peer-review published papers that are model-based, that have scenario, that are also scenario-based, published during the last 2 decades, the last 20 years. And what I'm going to share with you today is 5 key findings from that piece of work. But again, there's much more than these five points that I'm going to make today. Hopefully that will lead to a fruitful conversation with our panel. So number one, to our surprise, is actually not only that there is a thin literature available out there, but it's very, very recent literature. It's a fast growing, but it's a relatively new phenomenon. 90% of the papers that we retain in this systematic review were produced only after the Paris Agreement, right? The implication of this means that many African countries entered the Paris Agreement without any meaningful knowledge base to guide their decision and their positioning, right? And in fact, 60% of the papers are produced just the last 3 years. It's a really fast growing literature, which is much welcome phenomenon. But then when you look at the distribution across the continent, what you also see is that we have over half of the countries that do not have a single research paper that look at the issue at hand. And even for the countries that are covered, the knowledge base is nowhere where we need to have a really meaningful thinking about what are the different positioning that the various countries should be taking. So clearly there is a need to push for this literature to grow even more. Nigeria and South Africa are the economies that get the most analysis, the most coverage. Now, in terms of second point that I would like to talk about is the fact that when we dig deeper into the different papers and look at the assumptions being made and look at the choices being made in these papers, we, just like this morning and our earlier session in the morning, talking about going beyond the model, there is a lot of oversimplifications going on, right? The models tend to be techno-economic models, very little consideration of the social and political consideration that actually matter for policy implications, for application of this model, right? So only 4% of the papers do discuss actually the other factors that matter for the implementation of what they're finding in the paper, and that's particularly important. When you look at the horizon of the projections, you see that 93% of the papers are all projecting either 2030 or 2050, and these are well-known international targets. You would expect a range of years, and when you take the African Union agenda, for example, they will be particularly interested in the year 2063, 2065. But again, these international agenda tend to guide what is even the horizon that are being projected in these analysis. Finally, for such a complicated phenomenon as climate change, most of the papers end up presenting just a handful of scenarios. 1 to 6 scenario will constitute over 90% of the papers that we have documented in this work. So we think there is an oversimplification, and that also speaks to some of the discussion earlier in the morning. When it comes to development consideration, we try to look at whether these energy transition modeling have development outcome, for example, economic growth or employment or other factors that relate more to development side, that whether they have it as one of the outcome of interest in the analysis, right? But there also is very rarely the case. About only 6% of the papers have that explicitly as an outcome of interest. Otherwise, the vast majority of the time, the focus is really about the energy mix pathways or the emission trajectories. When we look at the implication of the assumptions about, let's say, energy consumption at the horizon 2050, what we see there, the largest number we could document from the papers that we've retained was about 1,500 kilowatt hours, right? Now, that may be more than double the current level of energy consumption in Africa, right? This is for 2050, that is 1,500. But that's like half the global average right now, right? And unless there is a miraculous decoupling between energy consumption, I'm not talking about emission, between energy consumption and economic activity, this means by 2050, we are talking about very low level of development that does not meet at all any development plan that you will look at that the governments are formulating on the continent. So these two literature need really to come together. Now, moving from there, the 4 point that we would like to share with you today is about technology. What we were looking at here is whether, to what extent the papers are restrictive in the technologies that they consider. We're not talking about an analysis where the science leads to not including certain technologies. We are talking about certain technologies being excluded from the get-go in the analysis, right? And when we look at that, clearly without a surprise, solar, hydro, and wind are leading the way. The other thing that we see is that despite all the push against fossil and all that, in most of the, or nearly all of the model, really, to some degree, gas, oil, even coal will feature to some degree in the transition period toward the net zero. But what we found is that when it comes to some of the key technologies like nuclear, geothermal, carbon capture, sequestration, or hydrogen, is these are the technologies that we think really matter for the future transition, that it will be also consistent with high economic development. Those are the least featured technology in our analysis. Now, moving from here, for my last two slides, we also look in this analysis about the intellectual leadership, which was also part of the discussion earlier in the morning, right? For these complex modeling exercises or research, which sometimes require, actually not sometimes, a lot of time require some value judgment, some normative decision to be made to build the model and make the projection. I think who does the analysis also matter, and where they come from matter, and the approach to which they come to the exercise is going to matter as well. So there, like Zainab highlighted earlier, nearly 2/3 of the papers are produced without a single co-author who is based on the African continent. We try to unpack that with a little bit more detail. I can't share all the details with you here, but one of the key similarity that we saw looking at just the papers themselves is that in terms of citations, we don't see any difference. But where we see differences is that the authors who are based outside of Africa tend to publish in higher impact factor journals. So journals that have higher reputation. The authors themselves, which will be the graph in the middle, the authors themselves, they have more higher reputation if we look at the reputation in terms of their citation, which is a traditional way of looking at the influence of researchers, right? So the non-African based researcher, more influence, publish more in higher rank academic journal, which means that you would expect also that they are more likely to be in the policy circle and invited in the policy discussions as well, right? So we try to look at the policy influence in another way by looking at a number of recent IPCC reports and looking at how many of these papers are cited in these reports. And when we do that, we find that 13% of the papers retained in our sample are cited in recent few IPCC reports. But of those 13%, 75% of them are the papers that are produced by researchers that are not without a co-author base on the African continent, right? And to finish, it's not our view that being based in Africa or being African itself is a prerequisite to produce knowledge on Africa. That's by no means our view, but it's just that for the type of knowledge that requires a certain number of value judgment, we may want to pay special attention on how these assumptions are made. So that's why we went further on this particular issue to look at some of the differences. Are Africa-based authors making assumptions that are different than those who are not based in Africa? That's the area that will really be interested, not necessarily their nationality or where they are based in themselves. So when we look at a number of dimensions on that particular point, we see two notable areas where the two diverge. So first of all, the Africa-based authors are more likely to be working on specific countries, whereas the authors who are based outside of the continent tend to model the continent as a unit. So that's to the extent that this matter for policy implication or even the technologies that you will consider when you are modeling the whole Africa versus modeling a single country in Africa, this is a notable difference. The other difference is about the technology. When it comes to technologies like nuclear, carbon capture, hydrogen, it is rather the authors who are based outside of the continent who tend to be more inclusive in these technologies when they are considered their modeling of the continent. But other than that, there are a range of notable dimensions that we enter this research caring about, for which we see no difference whether the author is based in Africa or not based in Africa. Some of these are like the projection horizon. Everyone is doing 2030 or 2050. Nobody is looking at any other date. So this is internationally guided target that they are looking at. The number of scenarios are limited for both of them equally. We don't see any difference there. And more importantly, when it comes to development consideration, it's also the same. African-based authors are not more likely to worry about the economic development implication of their projection than the authors who are based outside of Africa. So these are some of the key points that I wanted to share with you today. In the interest of time, I will abstain from going through what we're drawing as lessons or our thinking for the way forward. But I think this is a fair place for different people to have different views about what needs to happen next. But nevertheless, in the paper, we do provide some views about what we think need to happen next going forward. I'm going to stop here and thank you again for your attention.
Thank you very much, Moussa, for that clear, concise, and indeed sobering presentation of the findings of your paper. I would now like to, okay, can you hear me? Okay. I would now like to invite the panelists for the next aspect of this discussion. I would like to begin with Dr. Louis Verchot. He's a principal scientist and leader of the Land Restoration Group at the International Center for Tropical Agriculture and leads the CGIAR Mitigate Plus initiative on low emissions food systems. Next, I would like to invite Professor Nadia Maïzi. She's the director of the Transition Institute 1.5 at Mines Paris, PSL University, and a member of IPCC and lead author of IPCC Working Group 3 AR6. Lots of acronyms there. And finally, I would like to invite Dr. Olumide Abimbola, who is founder and director of the Africa Policy Research Institute in Berlin. We also have the chief economist for Africa at the World Bank, who was unfortunately unable to join us in person, but he has a message for us, which I'm going to play now, virtually.
Hi, Moussa. Thank you for inviting me to make a few remarks on your recent paper on climate and development in Africa. First, I want to congratulate you and your co-authors for an excellent meta-analysis that provides the current state of knowledge on the links between climate and development in the continent. Coming in the backdrop of COP27 in Egypt, this could not have been more timely, relevant, and urgent. So congratulations. In the interest of time, I'm going to make my remarks around two issues. There's a lot I could probably say about the paper. It's a very rich set of results and findings, and I'm sure that your participants will have enough time to actually provide a lot of very rich and insightful feedback. But I want to actually pick on two issues that are picked up in the paper and offer a few remarks. The first is what the paper actually finds to have been a weak link between development and energy transition in the research that you just assessed in the paper. And on that, I want to say that for the African continent, the most important challenge of development remains reduction of widespread poverty and inequality in all their dimensions. For the continent to achieve that goal, it will almost be impossible without high levels of growth, which is inclusive and sustainable. And this is where I believe climate and energy transition actions come in. Action on climate and energy transition will complicate that goal and that challenge, but they cannot be independent or separate from it. In fact, any future research that looks at climate and energy transition and the actions that Africans need to take will have to think of that in the context of the broader development challenge that Africa faces. And therefore, I hope that in the future, that will be the angle that most of this research, as it now accelerates, will take. The second is the finding that, in fact, in recent years, the research on climate change in Africa has accelerated. That's encouraging, and I hope more of it will continue. That trend will continue and probably even pick up. But what was worrying about that finding is the fact that the contributions of African researchers was small, and in many cases, especially when it comes to international discussions and voices, it was marginalized. That's unfortunate, because when we think about such issues, research on such consequential issues such as development and climate change, it really does matter what kinds of questions are asked, who asks them, in what context these questions are raised, what kinds of inputs are taken into consideration, and what kinds of voices are taken into consideration. And more importantly, how that research is socialized and leadership on taking action in order to implement the results from that research. So I do hope that in the coming years, people who are interested in African research and African contributions will support and will encourage much deeper and much more robust research and knowledge generation ecosystem in the continent. So let me stop here and wish you a fruitful and excellent discussion in Egypt.
Round of applause, please. Excellent. So I think now we have about 20 to 25 minutes. And I want to begin with, and I hope it's okay to just be on a first name basis. I don't want to, give you wrong titles, which is probably worse than mispronouncing people's names. And I want to begin with Louis. What was striking to me from the presentation we just heard is really this divergence between global models and analytics and African realities. I guess the key question is, and maybe this is really the foundational question a lot of us are asking, what really explains this disconnect that we are seeing? Why is this the case? Is it as a result of the use of narrow and restrictive approaches? Is it that the wrong questions are being asked, as we heard from Dr. Dabalen? Is it as a result of just underlying assumptions that are way off from the realities in African countries? Or could it also even be the quality of data? What is really going on? What explains this disconnect? And I have to emphasize that I do know that your expertise is around food systems and agriculture, but I guess the key point being made in the paper and more broadly is that climate change and the climate challenge goes beyond just the energy transition. And if we're thinking about transitions more broadly, we have to adopt a more integrated, expansive approach. So I'm sure your experience with agriculture and food systems will be very, very crucial here in helping us understand what is really going on and what explains the disconnect.
Thank you very much. So this disconnect and this mismatch between modeling results and reality, I think, it's a universal problem, and it's most acute, I think, and we see it a lot in Africa. Who remembers Jatropha in this room? You remember Jatropha? One person remembers Jatropha. Okay, two. All right. So Jatropha was going to be the miracle energy crop that was going to solve all the energy problems in Africa, not compromise food security, promote rural poverty, be appropriate technology for rural communities, and it was going to be a panacea, right? How many times have we seen panaceas in Africa? How many crops are going to solve all the problems? It's going to be cacao. It's going to be coffee. It's going to be jatropha. It's going to be lucena. We have a wide range of this. Why do we have this? I think because people really want to be extremely optimistic, and they don't check their assumptions ahead of time. Jatropha, it grows on degraded land. It grows on marginal land. It's not going to compete for food security. It's still a plant. It still needs nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, copper, calcium, magnesium to grow. It will grow, it will survive, but it will not produce, it will not thrive. Large areas of land were acquired and planted to jatropha, and these were subsequently abandoned. But that didn't stop the land grabbing, and it didn't mean that the communities that were left behind afterwards weren't worse off. There was a lot of communities were left worse off because they had lost access to land, lost access to resources. So I think the jatropha, and that's the connection between land and energy. If we're going to be dealing with anything associated with bioenergy, you're going to be talking about land in Africa. We have to understand that we need to be realistic about the assumptions, and we have to understand that there are no magic bullets. We can't jump through steps. We can't just find the solution and not do the hard work. Solving the problems in Africa are going to require the hard work. Solutions are going to have to come locally, not from outside. They're going to have to be based upon local ecological knowledge. They're going to have to be based on careful scientific testing of solutions before we get communities to start investing in these things and scaling them up where we don't really have solid evidence for what's going to happen. So I think that what you're seeing in energy and these energy types of solutions are the same things we see in agriculture very often, is this disconnect. We have these models that show this, that, based upon X, Y, Z assumption, and we don't question the underlying assumptions. We don't verify them. And that's because we often don't have people who know the systems as part of the author teams on this, right? So if you don't have Africans, or you don't have people, local communities telling you this is feasible, this is not feasible, this is going to work with our social system. If you look wherever we've had success, governance is much more of an important determinant of success than is the technology. I work a lot on deforestation. Brazil resolved a lot of its deforestation emissions through governance. And then it reversed its deforestation gains through poor governance, or through governance that had alternative objectives, depending upon your perspective. Indonesia has reduced its emissions because of governance. If you look at where Africa has made advances, it's because you have good governance creating enabling environments and careful assessment of the options that are out there and what's likely to work within the social system. So your point on the politics are often ignored in models. Models don't do politics, but you can't take the models without doing a double check against the politics. So I think all of these elements combine to determine why we're going after these magic bullets, and why we're disappointed time and time again, and what we really need to be doing in how we modify our approaches to transforming energy systems, food systems, financial systems, waste systems on the continent. We really need to take a systems level understanding of the complexity, and we need to factor in the politics and the enabling environment if we're going to make some progress. Thank you.
You have given us a lot of interesting insights. But what I find also very striking is what you just said about this being a universal problem. And over the past couple of years, we've seen quite a number of analyses, publications, and even media reports explaining how there's just a gross underrepresentation of African voices in a lot of areas of scientific research. One that was quite prominent last year before COP26 was the one published by Carbon Brief. They did an analysis of the Reuters hot list of 1,000 most influential climate scientists, and they found that out of the 1,000, there were only 5 Africans in the list, right? And also earlier this year, the IPCC 6th assessment report, and I'm sure Nadia will know this very well, it had a chapter, I think chapter 9 on Africa. And in that chapter, it focused on, there was a section of it on funding that goes to research on climate change in Africa. So funding on climate research in Africa. 78 of that funding went to researchers in North America and Europe. This is for research on Africa. So, across the board, we find that there's this underrepresentation of people who are more likely to have local knowledge, as you mentioned, are more likely to understand political economy dynamics that can shape the implementation of policy insights that you generate from research. So this is where I want to bring in Nadia, because you have had the experience of working on these IPCC reports, which are so influential in climate science, but also in the discourse around climate change and also policies that are put forward. What is your experience on that front with respect to why there's such an underrepresentation of African voices, but also perhaps voices and researchers and people from a lot of the countries that are most affected by climate change?
Yeah, thank you very much, Zainab, and thank you for this invitation. So regarding the underrepresentation of African scientists in IPCC report, I would like to mention also the underrepresentation of women scientists in this report as well. And I can tell you about my own experience in the chapter where I was involved. So we were 15 scientists, and there was only one woman from Nigeria. And we had African people, but that were based in Europe or in the United States. And I have seen the difficulty of my colleague scientists from Nigeria regarding different points. First, because it was during the COVID period, we had a lot of sessions by Zoom, problem of connection. So she was not able to follow all the meetings. Secondly, problem of getting a visa in order to travel when the meetings were abroad. So I think it's very simple, clear facts that create a gap between the different scientists, first in their everyday life and the way they can operate their science. And then, even if there were other scientists coming from Africa, but now based abroad, the way climate change is treated or is received in Africa seems not to be as importantly treated than what it is done in the north. I think the study has reflected that very well. So the different publications have come through the last years, and I suppose that if there is only 13%, I think, of the papers that were cited in the IPCC report is also because the papers that are cited must have been published before October 21. So if the study was recent, so that might not be fulfilled by this publication. And also we had a very interesting exchange when the report has been released with all the colleagues of the chapter to see how importantly it has been seen in their different countries and how often they have been contacted by journalists and media in order to get some comments about the report. So we had one woman from Iran and my colleague from Nigeria, and they had no solicitation by the media, by the politics, and by anyone about what was the release of their chapter or of the report in a larger way. And coming back also to the question of how to get some notoriety in order to promote the results that you are treating. I will also share with you another experiment because I'm half Algerian, so North Africa, and as a scientist based abroad, I did a study with a PhD student based in Algeria about energy transition in Algeria. And I understood that it's very badly received by the people of the country because you look like you're coming from abroad and you're going to tell them what they have to do, even if you have considered the specificities of the countries because you know it and you have collected best data that you can. There is this vision of interfering with the problem of the country. And I had also this very interesting remark while providing the result, because, okay, the situation in Algeria regarding energy is very specific because it's like 98% based on gas for its power system. And because the future that we were seeing was not really a good one, they told us, yes, but why don't you introduce electric vehicle and energy efficiency like we do, like you do in Europe? And that is very also important, the fact that people don't want to look or to face or to assume the difficulties that they have in their own country and dream about technologies that are absolutely not well suited to the problems that they have to face, but consider that it's like it's a shame not to appeal for them. So I think that there is also this problem of reconciliating people with their own heritage, culture, and specificities, and that's part of the challenge. So I would say, and I would finish with that, that I was very impressed by another experiment in Canada, where I have to give an expertise about different projects, where I have seen that for specific areas, when you propose a project regarding this question of energy transition and so on and so forth, you have to include the local communities in the proposal, but not only, to make a little greenwashing, really to include them in order for them to explain to the scientists what is the culture, what is their way of living inside the environment, and in order to really create a proposal which will be half scientifically based and half based on what is the reality on the area itself. And I think it's very interesting, and there is a lot to learn from this kind of project.
What is so interesting about what you just explained to us is how you have located the problem in, of course, the global environment and the difficulty that African researchers and African scientists and others face in accessing certain privileged spaces, either physically in attending conferences or even intellectually in accessing, paywalled journals, which have certain kinds of criteria that are not easily met. But very importantly, I think you get to something that a lot of us are often not willing to admit, that even in the researchers' own home countries, what is valued as good science, good analysis that is worthy of policy uptake tends to be rather complex, to say the least. Oftentimes governments don't value research, science produced locally. Oftentimes stakeholders want simple solutions that Louis was talking about. So it's one thing for someone else to come with a very simple solution. It's another thing also for governments, for funders, even locally, to say, oh, we just want something simple that will address a systemic issue in 3 months. or in 6 months. So I thought that was very, very insightful. I think now I want to bring in Olu. And Olu runs a think tank in Berlin. So he understands, in a sense, both sides of the equation. And my specific question is, now that we are really getting to a better understanding of where the issue lies, at the root of a challenge of, modeling and scenarios and forecasting is really a bigger issue around inclusion and representation and voice. So how should stakeholders who are interested in addressing this problem, and there's so many people, I'm part of so many conversations already on addressing this challenge of inclusion, how should interested stakeholders go about it? How do we better elevate African voices, voices from the global south in climate research? And before I hand over to you, I want to emphasize that even us at the Carnegie Endowment, we are thinking through this. So just last week, we launched a database of African-based climate research organizations with the explicit objective of trying or contributing to elevating African voices in climate research because we see the gap. So what else can be done? What should be done? Whether, we're referring to funders here, whether it's philanthropists, whether it's governments, whether it's international organizations, what can be done to address this challenge?
So Zainab, you're giving me the easy job, right? To figure out a solution to the problems. But first of all, I want to thank the CATF, Moussa, for the research and the presentation. So I think of it this way, that there appears to be a change already happening, right? We have more African voices contributing to this debate. So Moussa and co-authors are an example of that. So that's already happening. We are seeing more Africans picking up the debate around climate change and talking about it. The project you just described from your team on the database of African organizations working on climate change, even if they don't self-describe as climate change institutes, is another example of that. So we're seeing more of this actually happening. And I mean, I think these things didn't exist just a year ago or a year and a half ago, but they exist now. So the African voices that we're looking for, they're coming to the table and we're seeing them. So that's one part of it. The other part is, so at our institute, we currently have a project ongoing in West Africa, looking at climate adaptation in Nigeria, Ghana, and Senegal. And we're working with local institutes who work on climate change issues in general to do the research on these issues. And some interesting things are coming up. One of them is that, so we had a stakeholder event in Nigeria on Saturday. And one of the interesting things that I was talking to the team about this morning is the fact that there's research existing in Nigeria that we just don't see and we don't hear about. Much of it is happening in universities, their PhD studies, their master's thesis, but they don't leave that particular university, they don't get beyond that space. So there is already a lot of knowledge that is being produced by Nigerian and African universities on climate change. That's number one. Then number two, we also are noticing that the way we define knowledge is an issue, right? So if we expand the scope beyond what gets published in journals at all, so not just journals in the global north, but journals in general, then we start understanding that we're limiting what we think of as knowledge to a very specific set of knowledge that is produced and published in a certain way. So a good example is this. We know, so part of the project we're doing on the adaptation project is we know that people who are facing the harshest realities of the climate emergency on the ground, they're not waiting for some World Bank project from somewhere to come and help them. They are dealing with the knowledge. They are dealing with the situation with knowledge that they already have. So people already know how to deal with rainfall that is not, that isn't irregular rainfall. People already know this through several years of working as farmers, through knowledge that is passed down to them through generations of knowledge. They already know this, right? But in some way, we kind of don't include this when we talk about knowledge production in Africa. I mean, I understand that what makes it to policymakers in Washington, D.C. and in Berlin are often the things that are described in this study, which are extremely important. But at the same time, I think we shouldn't get stuck in that frame alone and accept just that definition as the definition of knowledge in general. So that's another point. The third point that I think of when I think of this is that we should also rethink how we present knowledge as well. So the standard way of doing this is to publish in a journal that has a high value in the Global North organization. We neglect the other side of the equation, which is publishing on the continent itself. We almost don't talk about what gets published on the continent and then look at what it contains. And I think we need to do that. So that's number one when it comes to presentation. Another point on presentation is that we are currently at APRI playing with the idea of having a report as a microsite. So instead of publishing another PDF file, which a study showed recently that the World Bank PDF files almost never get downloaded. So instead of having another PDF file that isn't downloaded, we're creating a website for a report that we're going to actually launch here in a couple of days, which the website is the report. And then looking for ways that it's easy for people to navigate through it, because what we're actually competing against isn't other reports, it's Twitter and it is Instagram. So how do we get to the point where we present knowledge in ways that are not stuck in these old ways of doing things when we already moved past that in other ways of life? So, I mean, that's another what I think about when I think of knowledge production in Africa. So, to summarize, I think a lot is already happening. I think we need to find a way of getting those out and sort of maybe looking for platforms to showcase them in some sense. I think we need to rethink how we think of knowledge and what we understand as knowledge. Because if we keep playing the game of things that we are not part of, we will always end up looking like we're losing. So we need to think of what knowledge means and knowledge production means, and then presenting knowledge, audio formats, video formats. If we are not careful, we are only talking to a certain number of people if we keep writing the reports that we're writing. Not everybody has a reliable internet connection. Not everybody can read texts. Audio, like podcasts, snippets of audio, all of these are things that I think we should imagine how to bring together to present knowledge that much of which is already there. I don't know whether I answered your questions, Zainab.
Absolutely. If I were to summarize some of the key points you made, it's really around rethinking what counts as knowledge and kind of expanding the scope of that concept of knowledge itself, but also thinking about how it's presented so that there is more uptake, right? You were talking about Twitter, etc. I just thought of TikTok. I'm not even on TikTok, but I remember seeing a video that was so compelling just last year. This lady was using interpretive dance to talk about how, and this is not to say I endorsed her messages, but I just thought it was very interesting. She spoke about how the military-industrial complex is one of the biggest emitters of greenhouse gases. And it was the most bizarre thing ever. She was dancing. She looked like an insect. She looked like different things. That video had over 20 million views in less than 3 days. I don't know which report gets even 1,000 downloads, not to mention 20 million views. And if you want to have policy impact and get uptake, I think we also need to rethink how we present these things. So very, very important. I think we have just about a few minutes to go. Are we going to take any questions? Anyone has maybe one or two very quickly? Even if we don't answer them, let me emphasize, because we have just a few minutes left. But we want to hear what you're also thinking. So the lady in green, can you give her the microphone?
Hi, Winnie Okello with the Africa Engineering News and Cambiamo. Thank you so much for stating that. I just really want to reiterate that it's important that we understand that words matter, language matters, and context matters. Because as you said, there's so much research going on the continent. And I would love to know what exactly are we going to do. And please amplify the work that you're doing, because it's important for us to really own our narrative when it comes to Africa Rising movement and really decentralizing outside of our technical spaces. So I would love to hear more about what can we practically expect, not just from Africans, right? But the globe, as well, because like we understand the authority that comes with our folks in the Western, hemisphere. So we want to see our folks in the West, our U.S., our Europe, and everybody else. What are you going to do to amplify the voices of those on the continent when we're stepping outside of the traditional box of what's considered technical research?
Thank you. Any other question? The gentleman there. We'll take 3 and then we'll have to close.
So I have a quick question.
Please introduce yourself.
Okay. My name is Zira Kwage, and I work as the Nigeria focal person for the African Climate Foundation. So my question is for Moussa. I think modeling is further down the data value chain, and I was wondering if you've looked at the earlier part around data collection, data aggregation, and even data availability itself. Do you think there are gaps there that we need to build in order to build better models? Or do you think the data availability is sufficient in Africa? It's a modeling challenge. I just wanted to clarify that.
Any other final question? No? Okay. So let's start with let's start with Moussa very quickly in 30 seconds, if you can address that question, and then everyone will give their closing remarks in 30 seconds.
Okay, for 30 seconds, I'll go straight to the point. So we do document the kind of data that is used in the different papers that we retain in the systematic review. They tend to circle around the same data sets, the global aggregate that are available and usually publicly available. But we've done another piece of work, and Lily, you were together with me on the working group with the Energy for Growth Hub. And we've documented that there is a massive data gap at 2 levels, right? The first level is that if you just go out there trying to get the data, it's not readily available. But the good news is that we suspect, and we've seen in some cases, the data is there. It's just not aggregated the way it needs to be. The governments aren't making them available. So it looks like if we put our act together with the will of the government, we should be able to have the data that we want. It might take a little bit of work to code them and organize them in a way that it can be used in the models. So no and yes. No, because the data is not really available, but yes, because it can be made available quite easily, I think.
Great. So let's go around the panel. Starting with Nadia, 30 seconds.
Okay, so just one comment, because I was thinking at the inverse, in Western countries, there are too many publications. And so I think we are facing the same problem in terms of communication. At the end, you have so many studies that never come out from the labs. And as you said, how many reports have been read so many times, that the TikTok video you mentioned. So in terms of getting into the action regarding climate change, it's a common problem that we have to face, the way making this going into the hand of the people.
Louis?
Thank you. So just to come back to the point of making African voices more prominent, 2 things I would like to say. One is the CGIR, the Consultative Group for International Agricultural Research. We're 15 research centers spread across mostly the tropics. Many ministers, directors of services, permanent secretaries, many people in the NGO community have come through our programs and have been trained in our programs for the past 50 years. We currently now have a partnership with New Zealand, specifically around training developing country scientists to get international experience, move out of where they're currently doing their work and get international experience and join the international community in the science that's developing around quantification of greenhouse gas emissions. I have 2 Cameroonian students with me in Colombia right now, working on Colombian problems, getting Colombian context experience. We're announcing 48 graduate students that will, at this COP, that will join this program this year and will spend between 3 and 6 months in an international center outside of their own country, gaining international experience and contributing to the international community, building up their networks. So there's a lot that's going on. And yes, there's an awful lot of African science, and it's evolving really quickly. I lived in Nairobi, and I left there, 14 years ago. And when I go back now, it's a completely different place at the intellectual and academic perspective. It's really moving fast. And we see this across the continent, in Senegal, in South Africa, in Uganda, in many parts of Africa. The scientific community is developing very quickly, and we're getting more and more African voices in the context. The CGIAR is really happy to be promoting it, and more of our scientists are African scientists. So we're not as Western as we were 50 years ago. We are very much an intergovernmental and international organization with a lot of scientists from a wide range of backgrounds. So we're diversifying the perspectives in our teams as well.
Great. Olu,
I'm going to end by just wondering two things. One, I'm going to wonder what would happen if the databases that you talk about, the data that exists in countries, if we had a way of actually making it accessible, working with governments to make it accessible so that it's actually usable for scientists in the country and also outside. I'm wondering what we need to do to get that to happen. And I'm inviting you to help me think along the same lines. So what do we need to do to get those, the data collected, sitting in some very private public offices? How do we get those out? So that's number one. And number two, I'm also wondering what we need to do to create a sort of platform, I don't know, where some university publications are actually available for us to see. Because like I said, I was surprised, and I shouldn't have been, that there's so much that is already being done that we're just not aware of. I wonder what we need to do to make those things come out. Some of them will be bad, just like a lot of research is bad. And some of them will be very good. How do we access them? I mean, that's what I'm wondering. What do we need to do to make that happen? Thank you.
Excellent. I think we've come to the end of this discussion. I think it's been so insightful. And in fact, it is the beginning of many more to come, because we're just scratching the surface of a very, very important issue here. And the bottom line is, when it comes to really analyzing, understanding energy transitions in Africa and the climate transition more broadly, we need to adopt a more systems-wide, comprehensive, integrated approach. To do that, we need to make more use of local knowledge, work with people on the ground, understand political economy dynamics, but that will entail working with better data, accessing more data, but very, very importantly, thinking about how we package knowledge, how we conceptualize it, how we disseminate it, and how we value it, particularly from policymakers and other key stakeholders. Thank you very much, everyone. This has been such a good conversation.